thousands of years, people sat on either side of the Atlantic Ocean independently from one another. Then, on one fateful day, the oceanic barrier was overcome by the infamous Spaniard Christopher Columbus, who took his first steps in North America in 1492, or what he assumed to be India. After a series of devastating invasions, the Europeans made their home in America, after nearly wiping out all native civilizations who were unadapted to the influx of new diseases and viruses such as smallpox. More than a century later, the explorer Vitus Bering sailed his ship through the strait between what is now Siberia and Alaska in 1728, which was later named after him. It soon became obvious that this location was the smallest area of separation between the Americas and all other inhabited continents. Moving into the 19th century, the prolific geologist Charles Lyell wrote about several groundbreaking observations that helped other scientists understand that the Earth is in fact incredibly dynamic and ancient. In his work, Principles of Geology, he explained how the geological processes that occur today have always happened, and we can trace these events by observing the patterns in rock layers. This book had a profound influence on science at the time, and Lyell's fan base grew within the academic world. One of Lyell's biggest fans happened to be Charles Darwin, who carried a copy of the book with him as he voyaged around the coasts of America. Darwin was one of the first to assume the relationship between the distribution of ancient species and past glaciation periods, an idea that was popularized by James Kroll. In his book On the Origin of Species, Darwin predicted that such global ice coverage could have been responsible for intercontinental animal migrations, but this was merely an attempt to deal with the confounding observations. Later in the 19th century, the Canadian surveyor G.M. Dawson turned the focus away from evolutionary history and back towards the coastlines of the Bering Strait. He was the first to speculate that Alaska and Asia were once connected by a bridge of land in a period without glaciation that had since sunk under rising sea levels. His theory was later supported by fossil evidence around this hypothesized land bridge, in which enormous mammoth bones were discovered on the remote islands between Alaska and Siberia. Obviously, as one of the largest megafauna to exist in evolutionary history, the mammoth would have had no way to swim out to these islands. But why did the land bridge become submerged? One of the first scientists to try and answer this question was Reginald Daly, a Canadian geologist of the early 20th century. Daly created the glacial control theory, which assumes that when lots of glaciers cover the continents with a thick layer of ice, there will be less water in the oceans, since a significant amount of water is trapped on land as ice. This meant that during a glacial period, the Bering Strait would have likely been exposed land, having relatively shallow seawater. Today, all of the glaciers have melted, draining their water into the sea, and so the bridge of land is no longer visible to us. Glacial control theory assumes alternating periods of glacial and interglacial events. But what was causing these periods? What most geologists had not considered at this point was that a vital force had been playing a role in the history of the Earth all along: gravity. Specifically, there are three variables found to be the predominant influences on climate change: eccentricity, or the variation in the shape of orbital path; obliquity, the angle of Earth's axis; and precession, the direction of Earth's axis of rotation. These three elements together make up what is considered a Milankovitch cycle. Milankovitch not only develops the theory, but also came up with the crude model for how these cycles would have played out in the past. Milankovitch cycles arguably would have determined if the Bering Strait was exposed or submerged throughout history. But none of these groundbreaking discoveries determined if our own species used the Bering land bridge as a gateway into America. Watch Chapter 3 of this series to learn more.